Pick that up, sweetheart, or is basic coordination not covered in your bargain basement nursing school? That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before Captain Josh Reeves began dying on the 4th floor. But Elena Martinez was not yet aware of what was coming. She moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ER with the steady rhythm of someone who had controlled bleeding in darker places than Portland's Friday night chaos, her hand steady as a surgical laser while the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above stainless steel instrument trays. The construction worker on Bay 3 had split his forehead on a steel beam, 7 stitches, maybe 8, and Elena was threading the needle with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her civilian resume. Her navy scrubs hung loose on her frame, and when she reached for supplies, a tarnished military challenge coin shifted in her scrub pocket. The coin had belonged to Captain Josh Reeves once, given to her son in Marja 3 years ago as a promise that he would come home. Her son was a weapons sergeant now, and the coin was all she carried of him into this hospital every day. The weight of it felt like an anchor. Like a mission statement. Like everything that mattered compressed into brass and scratches. From the nurse's station, Dr. Whitfield watched her work. His jaw moved with calculation, the way a man's jaw moves when he is adding numbers in his head and does not like the sum. He was 46 years old, wore a watch that cost more than Elena's monthly rent, and had built his entire practice around the understanding that the world rewarded confidence more than competence. What he was seeing now, the way Elena charted every milliliter, every medication name spelled without abbreviation, her penmanship unnaturally precise, was a problem he had not anticipated. It was a problem that required solving. The patient's wound stopped bleeding at stitch number 6. Elena tied the final knot with her left hand while her right hand was already moving toward the sterile gauze, wasting no motion, wasting no time. This was how someone worked when they had learned efficiency in places where inefficiency meant someone else paid with their life. She did not know that Whitfield was watching her like a man watching an adversary move across a chessboard. She did not know that he had already begun calculating how to neutralize her. Cedar Creek Medical sat 11 blocks from the Willamette River, a Level 2 trauma center with good outcomes and a billing department that Whitfield had quietly cultivated for 18 months. The kickback arrangement was elegant. MedSupply Solutions would overbill surgical cases by 12 to 15% on items that did not exist or existed in smaller quantities, and Whitfield would approve every invoice without the scrutiny that someone with actual attention to detail might provide. The arrangement had netted him $247,000 since January. Until 3 months ago, when they transferred Elena Martinez from Seattle General. Her first week, she had flagged a discrepancy in the surgical wing. A phantom invoice for $15,000 in advanced hemostatic gauze that had never left the warehouse. Her second week, she found another one, orthopedic implants billed at 300% markup for cases that had used standard equipment. She did not report them. She simply noted them in her meticulous charts, which meant Whitfield had watched the noose tighten around his operation with every shift she worked. She was like someone walking through a minefield with a metal detector, and he was the one standing at the far edge wondering if the next step would detonate everything. The construction worker thanked her when she was done. "You're good," he said, watching her apply the final dressing with tape placed at precise angles. Elena's response was 4 words. "Keep it dry for 5 days." She did not smile. She did not need to. The work had already spoken. At 12:41 p.m., Elena sat alone in the cafeteria on the 3rd floor, reviewing patient charts with a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow. The cafeteria was nearly empty at this hour. Most of the staff grabbed food in transit, eating while walking between floors, sustained by adrenaline and the kind of professional fatigue that made anything taste like metal an obligation. Elena preferred silence. Silence allowed her to think. Silence allowed her to listen to what the charts were telling her. Whitfield arrived at her table with his lunch tray held like a weapon, his smile sharp as surgical steel. He was accompanied by 2 members of the hospital's Finance Oversight Committee, men whose names Elena had learned but whose motivations she had assessed long ago. They wanted 3 things: money, comfort, and the absence of problems. Whitfield provided all 3. She was becoming a 4th thing, which was very inconvenient. "Martinez," Whitfield said, his voice warm as a heat lamp and twice as false. Let's talk about your charting practices. Elena set down her pen. Her fingers did not tremble. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly as it always was, respectful, measured, deferential. Is there a problem with my documentation, Doctor? Not a problem, exactly, he said, and the men with him smiled the kind of smile that came from knowing they were witnessing a predator establish dominance. It's more that you seem to be spending an unusual amount of time on administrative tasks. We worry you might be overlooking your primary clinical responsibilities. Patient care, you understand. The thing that actually matters. Elena understood. She understood completely. What Whitfield was doing was establishing a narrative. If she made errors in patient care, he could point to her obsessive charting as the cause. If she could not be rushed, she could be discredited. If she could not be discredited, there were other options. There were always other options for men like him. I prioritize clinical care, Elena said. Her hands remained flat on the table. The charting follows from that. Well, that's good to hear, Whitfield said, and he sat down without being invited, which was a small assertion of power designed to reinforce hierarchy. The two men with him remained standing, sentries at the perimeter of a negotiation that was not really a negotiation at all. Because we've been reviewing your transfer paperwork from Seattle General, and some of your previous supervisors had interesting comments about your attention to detail. One of them suggested you had a tendency to become fixated on procedural minutiae. Is that fair? Elena had been a combat medic in Kandahar for 18 months. She had treated 847 casualties in a field hospital that used supplies scavenged from 3 different countries and replaced surgical instruments with careful boiling and prayers. She had held a position for 11 hours while her entire corpsman team was pinned down outside Marja, and she had not once allowed her attention to waver or her hands to shake. She could certainly maintain composure while a man in a $6,000 suit tried to manipulate her with falsified references. No, Elena said. That's not fair. Interesting, Whitfield said, and his smile widened by half an inch. Because I'm looking at a note here from your Seattle supervisor that says, he paused, reading from a document that Elena had never seen and was almost certainly fabricated, demonstrates obsessive attention to administrative procedures at the expense of team cohesion. Ring any bells? Elena picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. The ritual of the gesture was the point. It was a way of saying without words, you have no authority over me. Not today. Not ever. My charting is thorough because patient safety requires it, Elena said. If that creates friction with management, I understand. But I won't compromise documentation to improve morale. This was the moment where Whitfield's eyes darkened by a fraction, where the smile became something slightly less friendly and slightly more functional. He had expected her to defend herself or explain herself or ask for forgiveness. Instead, she had simply restated her position with the kind of calm that made it clear she was not seeking his approval. Well, he said, standing with his tray held in one hand, we'll see how well that works out for you. He nodded to the two men, and they followed him like satellites orbiting a planet. Enjoy your lunch, Martinez. When they had gone, Elena sat in the silence of the nearly empty cafeteria and allowed herself a single small gesture. She placed her hand over the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket and held it there for 3 seconds. Long enough to remember that she had survived worse than office politics. Long enough to remember that her son was alive because a man had believed in something more than his own advancement. Long enough to know that she would not break, would not bend, and would not give Whitfield the satisfaction of her fear. The next voice she heard was the intercom crackling to life with the code that would change everything. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. The words were already moving when they came through, her muscle memory overriding her conscious mind, her feet carrying her toward the elevators while her hands were already recalculating, already diagnosing, already preparing. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that the man dying on the 4th floor was Captain Josh Reeves. She had no idea that everything she had built in this hospital over the last 3 months was about to collapse in the next 5 hours, and that her greatest strength, the attention to detail that Whitfield feared would become the weapon that saved his life and ended his career in equal measure. All she knew was the sound of the elevator doors sliding open and the weight of the challenge coin pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat, reminding her of what she was capable of. Reminding her of who she really was. But for now, in this moment, she was simply a nurse moving toward a crisis, her composure perfect as ice, her purpose absolute as death. Tuesday morning at Cedar Creek Medical started like every other morning, fluorescent lights casting their dead fluorescent glow across linoleum, the smell of industrial coffee and antiseptic layering the air like a second atmosphere. Elena sat alone in the cafeteria with her lunch tray positioned carefully in front of her, sandwich on the left, apple in the center, black coffee on the right, arranged with the same precision she applied to 4 lines and medication reconciliation forms. Her eyes moved across the medication reconciliation report in front of her, noting a discrepancy in the surgical wing supply logs that matched the pattern she'd been tracking for 6 weeks. 7 discrepancies now. All involving the same vendor. All flagged in her charts with the kind of meticulous documentation that would eventually trigger an audit that couldn't be contained. She didn't notice Dr. Whitfield enter the cafeteria. She noticed his shadow cross her table. He walked past with his own tray, deliberate steps, measured pace, then stopped 3 feet beyond her position. Turned. His eyes found hers across the crowded room, and something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. The cafeteria was full. 20 staff members. 2 surgeons in their whites. 3 residents comparing notes on a chart. A perfect audience. Whitfield walked backward toward her table, his gaze locked on Elena, and then his foot caught on nothing visible. The stumble was theatrical enough that everyone watching would later swear it looked accidental. His tray tilted. Coffee sloshed upward in a dark arc. The sandwich slid across the plate. His body twisted as if to catch it, and the entire tray descended directly onto Elena's carefully arranged lunch. The crash echoed across the cafeteria, tray hitting table, contents scattering, ceramic coffee cup shattering against linoleum. The room went dead silent. Elena's jaw tightened. Just once. The muscle contracted beneath her skin and then released, returning her face to the exact composure she'd maintained since arriving at Cedar Creek 3 months ago. She didn't look down at the destroyed lunch. She didn't look at Whitfield. She simply set down her pen, her movements precise as a surgical instrument finding its mark. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Whitfield's voice was loud enough to carry across the entire cafeteria. Loud enough that every nurse at the far table turned in unison. Loud enough that the surgeons paused mid-conversation. Or is basic coordination not covered in your bargain basement nursing school? Elena rose from her chair without responding. She kneeled on the linoleum, which was cold and slightly sticky beneath her knees, and began gathering the scattered items. The sandwich. The apple. Shards of the coffee cup, which she picked up carefully to avoid cutting her hands. Around her, the whispers started immediately, that soft hiss of conversation that happens when cruelty is visible and everyone wants to be part of witnessing it. 2 nurses behind her exchanged glances. A resident smiled into his juice. Whitfield stood above her for 3 seconds, watching, then walked toward the serving line whistling a song Elena recognized from a country radio station in the break room. She cleaned the floor with napkins from the nearby dispenser, her hand steady as a surgical laser. Not steady because she wasn't angry. Steady because anger was information, and Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had learned decades ago that trembling hands couldn't hold a weapon, couldn't apply a tourniquet, couldn't save a life. She finished, disposed of the ruined lunch and paper towels in the trash bin, and returned to her table as if the last 3 minutes hadn't happened. The medication reconciliation report was still there, waiting. She picked up her pen and continued reading. But that wasn't the worst part. 30 minutes later, Elena stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts when Whitfield appeared beside her with the clinical precision of a man who had timed his approach. The afternoon shift was present. The charge nurse, Patricia, who had worked at Cedar Creek for 18 years and had never challenged a doctor's authority once in that entire span. 2 floor nurses. A medical student on his rotation. The environment was crowded enough to be an audience and structured enough to prevent Elena from walking away. Whitfield set a stack of charts on the counter in front of her. Her charts. The documentation from the past 3 days. "Martinez, your charting is exhausting," he said, his voice conversational but loud enough for everyone to hear. "All these details. All these notes about supply usage and equipment logs. Do you think we have unlimited time? Do you think every for-start requires a paragraph?" Elena said nothing. She did not defend her documentation practices. She did not explain that her thoroughness had caught 7 instances of inventory discrepancies worth approximately $43,000. She simply waited, her hands resting on the counter, her face composed as still water. Whitfield flipped through the charts with exaggerated slowness, shaking his head. He pulled out one page, her notes from the surgical wing supply room, and held it up for the others to see. "Look at this. Single for insertion. She's documented the gauge size, the insertion angle, the skin prep solution, the patient's vein quality, the dressing applied. Paragraph after paragraph. It's..." He paused for effect. "Tedious." He dropped the charts on the counter. Not placed them. Dropped them with enough force that the entire stack slid across the polished surface, fanned out, and scattered toward the floor. Papers cascaded like an avalanche of white. Whitfield watched with the satisfaction of someone who had choreographed the destruction perfectly. Elena's fingers tightened briefly on her pen. So brief that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed the tendons in her hand contract. That was all. No sharp intake of breath. No color rising in her cheeks. No voice cracking. She set down the pen and knelt to gather the scattered documents, her movements unhurried, her expression blank as a hospital wall. "Simplify your charting," Whitfield continued, addressing the room rather than Elena. "Or find work somewhere that appreciates tedium. There are plenty of clinics that would be grateful for your particular style." Elena gathered the pages into a neat stack, her hands moving with the kind of controlled grace that comes from years of practice in environments where one wrong motion meant disaster. She straightened, the charts organized back into their original order, and looked directly at Whitfield for the first time since the papers had fallen. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds on a flat horizon, empty of any emotion that might betray her. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I'll adjust my documentation." Whitfield's smile widened at the sound of deference in her voice. He had won the moment. He had made her kneel, made her gather papers, made her apologize for excellence. His hand moved to his wallet, and he turned toward Patricia at the charge desk. "I give her 3 days," he announced, his voice suddenly cheerful, the tone of someone announcing a pleasant wager on a football game. "Before she realizes she doesn't belong here. I'll put $50 on Martinez quitting by Friday. Anyone want to cover that bet?" Patricia's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The institutional hierarchy of a hospital is a weapon as precise as any surgical instrument. A doctor's word carries weight that a charge nurse cannot easily challenge. After a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, Patricia nodded. "I'll take that bet," she said quietly. "She stays." But her voice suggested she didn't believe it either. The whispers were worse than the insult. They followed Elena as she moved through the afternoon, quiet conversations that stopped when she entered a room, resumed when she left. By 3 p.m., the story had evolved. Elena had broken down in the cafeteria. Elena had talked back to Whitfield. Elena couldn't handle the pressure. The narrative was constructive, brick by brick, carefully assembled to make her departure seem inevitable rather than orchestrated. Elena completed her charting for 3 more patients, her documentation now stripped down to minimal detail, for gauge and site location, nothing more. She drew blood from a diabetic patient whose veins required careful technique, the needle sliding in on the first try despite the reduced information available. She checked medications for a post-surgical patient, her attention never wavering. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. Only the tightness around her eye suggested anything other than perfect calm. At 4:02 p.m., She took a break in the bathroom on the second floor, away from the main ER. She braced her hands on the sink, cool porcelain, slightly damp from someone's earlier use, and closed her eyes. Breathed in through her nose. Out through her mouth. The way she'd been trained. The way she'd learned in Kandahar, in villages that smelled like diesel fuel and dust, where composure wasn't a personality trait but a survival mechanism. 5 seconds of absolute silence. Then she opened her eyes, looked at her reflection in the mirror, and saw the woman she'd been trying to bury for 3 months staring back at her. The Navy Cross holder. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, who'd held a position for 11 hours while her team was pinned down in Marja. Who'd pulled Captain Josh Reeves out of a firefight with her own hands, whose son worked under Reeves's command and carried her photograph on every single mission because she'd taught him what real courage looked like. That woman existed somewhere beneath the nurse uniform and the false social security number and the manufactured nursing school transcript that naval intelligence had constructed. She touched the challenge coin in her scrub pocket. The one Reeves had given her son in Marja. Tarnished silver, dented from years of being carried through firefights and forward operating bases and midnight exfiltrations. She held it for 3 seconds, then released it and returned to the floor as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. And then the code alarm sounded from Trauma Bay 4, and Elena moved toward a crisis that would burn through everything Whitfield had built, expose every secret she'd carried, and reveal exactly who she really was. Room 437 was quiet except for the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, a rhythm so normal it had stopped meaning anything. Elena moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, blood pressure cuff, temperature check, visual assessment of the thoracic incision site where Captain Josh Reeves' surgery from the previous week had left him marked and healing. His eyes were closed. His breathing was even. Everything said recovery was tracking exactly where it should be. She didn't notice Whitfield watching from the hallway. She was too focused on the compression marks where the surgical staples held the incision together, checking for seepage, for redness, for any sign that infection was creeping in. Reeves' vital signs were solid. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate steady at 72. Blood pressure 120/80. The numbers said he was fine. The numbers lied. Elena was reaching to adjust the 4 line when Reeves' body went rigid. Not the rigidity of a man waking up. Something else. Something wrong. The heart monitor's steady beep accelerated into a frantic staccato, and Elena's eyes snapped to the screen. The rhythm that appeared there was not a rhythm at all, it was chaos, jagged lines that meant his heart was no longer pumping blood, just quivering, useless, dying. Code Blue, room 437, she called out, her voice cutting across the ward with the precision of a surgeon's blade. She slammed the code button as her hands moved, no hesitation, no second guessing, muscle memory taking over from the part of her training that had learned this in the dust and blood of Kandahar, not in some sterile hospital classroom. She positioned herself at Reeves' chest and began compressions, hard and deep, her entire body weight driving down through her palms into his sternum at 110 beats per minute. The sound of ribs compressing, the resistance of human bone accepting force, it was information. It was data. Pain was evidence of work being done. A resident appeared in the doorway, then froze. Another nurse came running. They stopped short, watching Elena's hands rise and fall, watching a floor nurse perform a procedure that should have been performed by someone in a trauma bay with a full surgical team. 30 seconds into compressions, Elena pulled back and checked the monitor. Still fibrillation. Still nothing. She returned to the chest, compression after compression, the rhythm of it like a drumbeat that refused to keep a dead man alive. 90 seconds. No response. The defibrillator arrived, pushed by a resident whose hands were shaking. Elena stepped back for 3 seconds while they applied the pads, and the shock sent Reeves' body up off the bed like a puppet on a wire. The monitor traced a line. Flat line. Elena was back at his chest immediately, resuming compressions without waiting for an order, without waiting for permission, because Reeves' heart was not responding to electricity and that meant the problem was deeper than fibrillation. She could feel it in the mechanics of the chest beneath her hands. The resistance was different. The compliance was wrong. Her eyes went to the surgical site, the incision from a week ago, the one that had given the surgeons access to his lungs and heart and the delicate architecture of vessels beneath. She saw it then, in the pale skin around the staples, a slight bulge. A pressure building where pressure should not exist. Cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardium, the sac around his heart, squeezing it, suffocating it, making every standard compression worthless because his heart couldn't refill between beats when it was being crushed from the outside. "Get me a thoracotomy tray," Elena said. Her voice was a flat command, the voice of someone who had not asked a question but issued an order that expected immediate compliance. The resident stared at her. What? You need to. Now, Elena said. One word. It came out like a rifle shot. The resident moved. Nurses moved. Someone was dialing surgery. Elena tore open what remained of Reeves' gown, exposing the surgical staples that held his incision together, and without hesitation, without waiting, she began pulling them out with her bare hands. The small metal staples came free with a sound like tearing fabric, and blood began to weep from the opening. She spread the incision wider with her hands, her training from 3 years embedded with special forces in Marja overriding every protocol that said a civilian floor nurse should never, under any circumstances, perform open-chest cardiac massage. Her hands disappeared into Reeves' chest cavity. The warmth of it, the wetness, the texture of tissue and muscle and the desperate fragile architecture of a human being's internal organs, her fingers found his heart. She could feel it quivering, not beating, just trembling uselessly against her palm. She began to squeeze. Rhythmic. Controlled. Her hand became his heart, contracting, releasing, 110 compressions per minute, pumping blood through his body while the organ itself remained paralyzed with the pressure of accumulated fluid around it. "Someone page the surgeon," Elena said calmly, her hands inside a man's chest, her voice steady as a laser. "Trauma team. Priority 1. The room had gone silent except for the monitor and her instructions. Nobody moved unless she told them to move. 2 nurses stood frozen in the doorway, watching a woman in scrubs perform a procedure they had only read about in textbooks. One of them looked like she might be sick. Elena did not notice. Elena was focused on the rhythm of compression, on the feel of blood beginning to move again through vessels beneath her fingers, on the cardiac monitor that showed the first tentative sign of an organized rhythm emerging from the chaos. 3 minutes of open chest compression. 4. The cardiac monitor began to show something that looked almost like a heartbeat. Elena felt it then, Reeves' heart contracting beneath her hand, a real contraction, not just the mechanical response to her compression but an actual electrical impulse, his own heart beginning to remember how to beat. She continued. 7 minutes total. That's all it took. 7 minutes with her hands inside a dying man's chest, feeling his heart come back to life under her rhythmic massage, before the cardiothoracic surgeon finally arrived and she could step back, let someone else take over, let her hands release what they had been holding. The surgeon took one look at the open chest cavity, at the blood pooled in the pericardium, at Elena's hand soaked in blood up to the wrists, and stopped in the doorway. What the hell? His eyes went to the monitor, to the organized rhythm, to the captain's pressure beginning to stabilize at 78/42. What the hell did you do? Cardiac tamponade, Elena said. Her voice was steady. He was bleeding into the pericardium. Standard CPR was ineffective. Direct compression was the only option. The surgeon stepped forward and took over, his hands moving where hers had been, and Elena stepped back, stripping off her gloves, her scrubs dripping blood onto the tile floor. The cardiothoracic surgeon examined the surgical site, assessed the damage, made 3 small movements with his hands, and then nodded. The monitor showed the cardiac rhythm stabilizing further. Reeves' blood pressure began to climb. 84/45. The room exhaled. But Elena did not exhale. She was already moving toward the sink in the corner, already washing the blood from her hands, already thinking 3 steps ahead because she knew what she had just done. She knew what she had just revealed. A floor nurse did not perform open-chest cardiac massage. A floor nurse did not have the training, the muscle memory, the absolute lack of hesitation that would allow her hands to slide into another human being's chest cavity without flinching, without asking for permission, without the pause that any civilian medical professional would have taken. Whitfield was already in the hallway, his phone to his ear, his face doing the calculation that meant he understood exactly what he had just witnessed. Elena could see him through the window of room 437, could see him smile, could see the moment he decided that this an authorized procedure, this evidence of capabilities no standard floor nurse should possess, this was the weapon he needed. She dried her hands on a paper towel and did not watch him walk away. Within the hour, Whitfield moved with the precision of a man executing a calculated strike. His office door was closed. His phone was in his hand. The first call connected to Gerald Hutchins, board member, a man whose malpractice settlement Whitfield had personally concealed 5 years ago when Hutchins' nephew had left a surgical sponge inside a patient's abdomen. "Gerald, we have a liability issue," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as lake water. "A nurse just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a post-op patient. Direct cardiac massage. Hands inside the thoracic cavity. No surgeon present. No protocol authorization." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I need her credentials reviewed immediately. Before this becomes a joint commission nightmare." Hutchins agreed before Whitfield finished the sentence. The second call went to the State Nursing Board's night supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had once dated Whitfield briefly. "Patricia, I'm reporting a concerning incident," Whitfield said carefully. "One of our floor nurses displayed unusual composure and technical capability during an emergency that suggests possible substance use. She moved with a precision and confidence that defied her credentials. I recommend a full investigation including drug screening and background verification. For patient safety, you understand." The words hung in the silence like hooks. The third call reached the hospital's credentialing office. "Elena Martinez transferred here 3 months ago from a placement agency. I need her previous employment references verified. Something about her background doesn't add up. Her prior employers, her certifications, her medical knowledge, it all exceeds typical RN training. I'm not making accusations, but I need documentation that everything is legitimate." By 6 p.m., the chief nursing officer summoned Elena to her office on the second floor. Elena walked the same corridors she had navigated that morning, past the staff who would not meet her eyes, past the break room where her empty mug sat in the sink unwashed. The CNO, a woman named Morrison with 23 years of nursing behind her, sat with her hands folded on her desk. "You saved a patient's life today," Morrison said carefully, and those were the hardest words Elena had heard all day because they were the truth. "But you performed a procedure outside your scope of practice. Dr. Whitfield has filed a formal complaint. The state board has been contacted. There's an investigation pending into your background credentials and your conduct during the emergency." Elena sat perfectly still. Her hands rested in her lap. Her breathing remained steady. "I did what was necessary," Elena said. "I believe you," Morrison replied, and she meant it. Elena could see the conviction in the woman's eyes, could see that Morrison understood the mathematics of triage and survival. "But I can't protect you from this. The complaint is already filed. The board has already opened a case. You're suspended pending investigation. I need your badge, effective immediately." Elena reached for her badge, the Cedar Creek medical credential with her photograph and her false name printed in clean sans serif font. She had worn it for 91 days. She unclipped it from her scrubs and placed it on Morrison's desk. The sound it made hitting the wood was like a weapon being surrendered. "I understand," Elena said. At 9 p.m., 2 hospital security officers escorted Elena through the hallways toward the employee exit. She carried nothing except her jacket and her dignity, which was a kind of armor that could not be breached. Staff members averted their eyes as she passed. Nurses found sudden business with their patients. One surgical tech actually turned and walked the opposite direction rather than encounter her in the corridor. In the distance, she could hear the faint rhythm of monitors and the intercom's measured tones, the soundtrack of a hospital that no longer had a place for her. Whitfield watched from the nurse's station as she reached the elevator. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man whose calculations had proven correct, whose network had held, whose enemy had been neutralized without his having to lift a hand in violence. He simply smiled and made a note in his personal file. At 3 a.m., Elena sat alone in Sal's diner on Powell Boulevard, the only customer in the fluorescent desert of a late-night establishment where insomniacs and third-shift workers came to exist. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago, the ceramic mug sweating condensation rings on the laminate table. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, a woman in civilian clothes, no badge hanging from her neck, no mission coordinates, no purpose threading through her veins like blood. The tarnished challenge coin sat in her jacket pocket. She could feel its weight like a stone. Captain Reeves had given it to her son David in Marja 3 years ago, a token of respect from a commanding officer to a weapons sergeant who had performed beyond standard. David carried it on every deployment. Elena had been given a photograph of her son holding it, a single frame transmitted through classified channels that reminded her why the mission mattered. She had failed. The mathematics of it were simple and brutal. She had been inserted into Cedar Creek Medical to monitor Captain Reeves during his recovery, to ensure his safety, to maintain his security until he was cleared for duty. By performing the cardiac massage, by revealing capabilities that only a military operative would possess, she had compromised her cover. By saving Reeves' life, she had ended her ability to protect him going forward. The Naval Intelligence Command would have to pull her, would have to scrub her background, would have to stand down the mission and accept that she could no longer function in the role she had been assigned. Her son would return from deployment in 14 weeks to find his mother had failed the one assignment that mattered most. Not because she lacked the skill or the courage, but because she had chosen a patient's life over her mission parameters. A waitress whose name tag read Susan refilled Elena's coffee without asking, without making eye contact, without acknowledging that this woman at the corner table had the look of someone whose world had recently stopped spinning. Elena did not notice. She stared at her reflection and wondered if forgiveness was a thing her son would be capable of offering. The rain had started sometime around midnight, and now it hammered against the diner's windows like Morse code, like static, like the distant sound of a helicopter that would never come to retrieve her. Outside, Powell Boulevard was empty. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous frequency, a sound like surrender, a sound like machines keeping track of time while human beings tried to remember how to survive it. Elena's hands rested on the table, steady and motionless, the hands that had held Captain Reeves' heart, the hands that had failed their mission, the hands that belonged to a woman with no badge and no identity and no way back. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She sat in the harsh light of the diner and accepted that sometimes the bravest choice and the failure were the same thing, and that her son would have to decide which one mattered more. 6 days after Elena sat alone in the fluorescent glare of Sal's diner, a Somali man in his 30s arrived at Cedar Creek Medical's ER with acute appendicitis and the kind of shaking hands that come from recognition rather than pain. His name was Hassan. 3 years ago, under a dust storm in Marja that turned the sky the color of rust, he had watched Elena Martinez coordinate a medevac extraction under fire while her corpsman team pinned down and bleeding out, watched her stand in the open while rounds cracked past her head, watched her refuse to move until every wounded soldier was loaded. His eyes found hers across the ER intake desk, and his finger pointed like a weapon. Phantom. You are Phantom. The name hung in the air like a shell casing falling on tile. The charge nurse did not understand. The resident did not understand. But the veteran security guard, a man named Thomas Clayton who had served under Navy command at Camp Lezan, who recognized the voice of someone who had lived through things that do not fit into civilian categories, went rigid. His hand moved to his chest in the half salute he had not used in 14 years. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. He said it loudly enough for the assembled board members touring the renovated surgical wing to hear, loudly enough that 2 administrators stopped mid-stride and turned, their eyes narrowing as if they were trying to translate a language they did not speak. The room did not go silent. Instead, it filled with a different kind of sound, the sound of understanding dawning, of calculation shifting, of certainty crumbling like dry concrete under pressure. One of the board members, Patricia Chen, the one who had seen Elena's billing discrepancy report 6 weeks ago, pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and made a single call. General Catherine Voss arrived within the hour. She did not wait for introductions or protocols. She walked directly to Elena's former ER bay where Hassan lay prepped for appendectomy, where Captain Reeves stood in his hospital gown looking like a man who had been sewn back together by very careful hands, where Dr. Whitfield had positioned himself near the doorway with the posture of someone already calculating escape routes. The general carried a tablet. She read from it the way a prosecutor reads charges. Bronze Star. Pause. Second Bronze Star. Third Bronze Star. The room held its breath like a held defibrillator paddle. 2 deployments as a combat medic embedded with special forces, conducted forward operations in Helmand Province, Kandahar Province, Logar Province, the kind of places that do not appear on civilian maps. The general's voice dropped lower. Navy Cross. Awarded for actions in Marja, Helmand Province, where Master Chief Martinez held defensive position for 11 consecutive hours while her corpsman team was pinned down and under enemy fire, prevented catastrophic casualty escalation through combat medical intervention under active engagement, and coordinated helicopter extraction of 14 wounded personnel. 11 hours. The number hung in the air like a patient vitals monitor reading something impossible. Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hand found the edge of the counter, steadied himself as if the gravity in the room had just increased by several factors. Captain Reeves sat forward in his bed despite the pain that clearly moved through his chest like broken glass. His voice when he spoke was steady as surgical steel. Elena has kept my heart beating twice now. Once in Marja when a Talib round punched through my abdomen and she held my intestines inside my body while we waited for birds. And once here, when her hands did what no protocol says a floor nurse should be able to do. He looked directly at Whitfield. Her son carries her photograph on every mission. Sergeant First Class David Martinez of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, keeps her picture in his body armor because his mother taught him that real courage looks like a quiet woman refusing to leave people behind. The words landed like artillery, each one precisely placed. Whitfield's phone began to vibrate. Once. Twice. A third time. He declined the call. Patricia Chen stepped forward with the certainty of someone who had finally connected data points that had been bothering her since Elena's termination 6 days prior. I've been reviewing the documentation Elena submitted before Dr. Whitfield had her removed. The billing discrepancies in the surgical wing. The supply orders that were 3 times normal volume but patient usage that remained constant. General, I believe Dr. Whitfield should explain why he requested the State Nursing Board investigate Master Chief Martinez for substance abuse while simultaneously suppressing reports about his own procurement practices. Whitfield's hands moved to adjust his white coat, a gesture so obvious it might as well have been a confession written in neon. The State Board inquiry I requested triggered an automatic audit of my own credentials. I understand federal investigators are now involved. His voice remained level, but the composure was theater now, a performance by someone who understood exactly what the next minutes would contain. The chief nursing officer spoke from the doorway where she had arrived silently, a small woman with grey hair and the bearing of someone who had run emergency departments for 23 years. They've been trying to reach you, Doctor. Something about inconsistencies in your surgical billing and your vendor relationships. A federal review is pending. Whitfield did not respond. He looked at the assembled board members, at Hassan, at Captain Reeves in his hospital gown, at General Catherine Voss who had fought in 3 wars and could recognize a man losing everything in his own ER bay. The weapon he had launched at Elena, the state investigation, the credential review, the institutional scrutiny designed to bury her, had boomeranged with a precision that suggested cosmic mathematics. By requesting verification of her background, he had triggered protocols that exposed his own fraudulent activities. By making calls to board members who owed him favors, he had drawn attention to the network of obligations and financial arrangements that kept his scheme functioning. By making her visible, he had made himself visible. Gerald Hutchins, the board member who owed Whitfield a favor for a recommendation letter 10 years prior, stepped away from him with the instinct of a man who smells federal prosecutors closing in. Whitfield's phone rang again. His attorney. He declined the call. His hands were shaking now. Not trembling, shaking, large obvious movements that belonged to a man whose control had departed with the efficiency of a medevac helicopter. General Voss closed her tablet with a soft click that sounded like a courtroom gavel. I'm recommending Master Chief Martinez for immediate reinstatement with full back pay and a formal apology from Cedar Creek Medical. I'm also recommending she be considered for a presidential appointment to the Veterans Healthcare Oversight Commission. Her combination of medical expertise and combat experience is invaluable. She looked at Whitfield with the patience of someone who had interrogated enemy combatants. Federal investigators will be contacting you regarding your billing practices and vendor relationships. The military takes fraud very seriously when it impacts facilities that treat service members. Whitfield left the ER in silence, his network collapsing like a building with its load-bearing walls removed. The charge nurse watched him go. Then she turned to Patricia Chen and held out a $50 bill. You were right, she said. That was not the kind of bet to make against a woman like that. But 5 hours after General Voss's phone call, the call that pulled Elena from her reflection in Sal's diner window and told her that her mission had not failed, that saving Captain Reeves was the mission, that her cover existed to be blown if necessary, Elena Martinez stood in the rose garden wearing her dress uniform with the Navy Cross gleaming on her chest like polished warfare. The tarnished challenge coin that had sat in her scrub pocket, the one that had felt like an anchor and a millstone both, was now pinned inside her jacket over her heart. Photographers' cameras flashed like artillery fire. The President introduced her as the newest member of the Veterans Healthcare Oversight Commission, a role that would let her protect service members from the kind of institutional predation that had nearly destroyed her, from the kind of corruption that hides behind white coats and board memberships and carefully cultivated networks of favors. Captain Reeves attended the ceremony in his own dress uniform, his chest bandaged beneath fabric that still held the scent of medical tape and antiseptic. He stood because the woman who held his heart in her hands twice deserved to see him vertical. Elena's son, Sergeant First Class David Martinez, watched via video link from a forward operating base 8,000 miles away, and his face split into a grin that his teammates would talk about for weeks. His mother's photograph, the one he carried in his body armor, now sat beside a monitor showing her in the rose garden, and the parallel felt like completion of something that had been broken in the dust of Marja 3 years ago. At Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Whitfield taught CPR to bored community college students in a rented classroom that smelled like old coffee and disappointment, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy for $18 an hour while his attorney negotiated a plea deal with federal prosecutors. The kickback arrangement with MedSupply Solutions that generated 6 figures annually had become evidence in a fraud case. The network had evaporated. The investigation he had weaponized against Elena had uncovered his own falsified billing records, his inflated equipment orders, his 18 months of systematic fraud. Gerald Hutchins testified against him in exchange for immunity. The charge nurse returned his $50 with a note that contained only 6 words, "You lose." In Sal's diner on Powell Boulevard, Elena sat at the same booth where she had thought her mission ended, but this time her son sat across from her in his desert camouflage, home on emergency leave, and Captain Reeves sat beside him, and her coffee was hot, and the reflection in the dark window showed a woman with nothing left to hide. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That was what her son said, quiet enough that only the 3 of them could hear. And Elena touched the polished challenge coin on her uniform and understood, finally, that quiet had never been silence. It had always been competence. It had always been the steady hands of someone who does what needs doing, the stubborn hearts that refuse to stop beating even when the world tries to make them quit. If you've watched this far, you know the kind of person I'm talking about. The kind who doesn't announce their strength but proves it through action. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were far more capable than you realized?